this is going to go kind of fast because I want you to have like an hour-ish to still take your test. You may not even need all of that time, but I still want you to have that time. Okay. So for number 1, you have to divide both sides by negative 67. This is what you should have done to get n equals negative 14. So some common mistakes I saw there were we added 67, but because these two are connected, we can't separate them like that. And because they're connected, that means they're multiplying. So we have to divide. Some of us divided but forgot the negative, so minor mistakes. But just be careful with that. So each question is worth 1 point. 1 mistake is drops down to 0.75. 2 mistakes, unless it's like a problem like this where there's really only 1 step. So really, if you added that, you missed the whole step. So that drops you down to 0.5. If it has multiple steps, or maybe you just didn't do something mathematically correct at all, it's 0.25. You get 0 if you rewrote the problem and didn't solve it, or didn't do anything. Questions on number 1? One thing I did want to say, make sure you're keeping your variables consistent. Don't start solving for n, but then change this to x, because now you've solved for something different. Make sure your variables are whatever it's solving for. And make sure when you put your answer, it is your variable equals that number, not just some random number, or not just your number. For number 2, there were 2 ways you could have solved this. I'll show you both. 1, the easiest, was probably subtract 8 on both sides. So that was probably the easiest. You could have also move 37 to the other side, but when you do that, it's going to create an extra step for you. So if I added 37 over here, I have to remember that this cancels and becomes 0. I can't just move the m across the equal sign. So because I moved 37 over to the 8, I now have to get rid of the 45 by moving it back. You would still get the same thing, it just added in an extra step. So be careful, be mindful of those things. The most common mistake I saw was maybe we started to do this, but then we moved m over here, now we have m equals 45. And then we will have missed some of the steps. Questions on that one? Number 3, we should have combined these two, did exactly what it said, added 4n and 4n, because they're like terms, to get 8n. And then divided both sides by 8. So some things I saw there were we were taking 4n, moving it to the other side. But if you did that, some of you got rid of the variable, like we had this, and maybe just did this instead. 1, we can't drop the variables just because. And 2, this wouldn't actually work because it's supposed to have an n with it, and these aren't like terms. So I could not combine those. And then any variation of that, let's say you kept going with that and you had 4 n's on both sides, dividing 4 would still leave you with an n on both sides, so that wouldn't work. Dividing 4n, 1, don't divide the variables because they cancel, so that also wouldn't work. But combine them and do exactly what it says. Questions on that one? Go ahead and close it. Okay. For number 4, we should have cross multiplied 11 to everything here and 10 to everything here. And when you cross multiply, whether you go ahead and multiply it first out and then rewrite it, or rewrite it and then multiply it, that part doesn't matter. But but when you rewrite it, you want the number in front of parentheses. I saw some where the number was after the parentheses, or the number was in parentheses and this wasn't, and that may have thrown us off. So put the number out front of parentheses. Anytime you have to distribute, make sure you're multiplying to everything. So if you just multiply to one piece, you'll miss the rest of that. And then once you got to this step, you had choices whether you did this in one step or in two. That was completely up to you. If we move 10x over by subtracting and move 44 over by adding, this cancels, so we end up with just 1x equals -6, and that would be your final answer. If you did it the opposite way, let's say you subtracted 11 and added 50, you would have ended up with -x equals 6, and then you would have had to divide both sides by a -1, because we can't leave that negative with the x. Questions there? So for the most part, we did pretty well in this first section. It was the second section that gave us more issues. But continuing, for this one, distribute. So we get 14x minus 12 equals 38 plus 4x. When you have, and I could have said this in the previous one too, but we can't combine like terms across the equal sign. I can't say 14 plus 4. You have to move things. Make sure you're doing the opposite. So if I see a plus, I'm subtracting. If I don't see a plus, assume it to be positive, unless you see a negative or minus. But always do the opposite. So that we get 10x equals 50, and we could divide both sides by 10 to get 5. Remember that you have access to Desmos to check yourself. So please, especially for the ones that are numbers, put that original equation back in, change the variable to x if you need to, and see, does your answer match? Do you have any questions on that one? In the last one, we kind of had a montage of different common mistakes here from all over. Combining like terms, adding and subtracting correctly, all of those things. So you could have combined these. Try to remember your variables whenever you need them. Be careful with your negatives. Because you would have got minus, plus, minus, plus on that right side. Double check your work. If you were combining like terms, the k's together, and then the numbers together, you would just do exactly what it says, not change anything. -60 minus 35. And then add the numbers together, 48 and 63, exactly as is. I could move the 95k over by adding. And then divide both sides by 111, and we should have gotten 1. It's really easy to mess up the end answer if we miss a negative or a positive at the beginning, or miss a variable and then we're adding things that we shouldn't be adding. So be very careful there. Do you have any questions about that one or anything in this section? So let's look at this bottom one. So make sure if you were struggling here that you're definitely paying attention to get help to fix this. Alright, so 7, 8, and 10 were probably the harder ones of all of these. The other ones should have been a little easier. And we'll walk you through how. There were a couple different ways you could have done this. I'll show you one. If you did the other way, you will see that you got the same answer, or should have gotten the same answer. One way, I'm trying to get A by itself. If you need to circle, highlight, underline your letter, that way you don't get confused and solve for something different. I want to get rid of everything around it, but maybe everything that's not directly connected to it first, so the 4. I can get rid of the 4 by adding. Be careful when you're writing. Some of us put Z, but then it changed to a 2, so then we added the 2 and the 4 by accident. So make sure that you're keeping track that this is a variable, not a number. And then we talked about this previously, that when dividing, if this number can go into either of these, you have to divide it separately. So 2 goes into 4, so I have to divide this all separately. And when you do that, your negatives, so just for this one, the Z over -2, I'm either going to move this to the front of the fraction or move it out up top. Like this. So negative Z over 2 minus 2 is what this one would change to, equals A. You could have also added 2A to both sides, got rid of Z, and then dealt with it that way. We would have ended up with the same thing. What questions do we have on that one? Or anything there that didn't make sense? 8 is going to be very similar. We're going to start off the same way, except in this case, subtract. So that we cancel out the 3's. Rewrite. And nothing here will go into 3, so I can divide the entire side by -2. But the negative, I'm going to do something different with that. So just like I did here, I want to rewrite it so that it's out front. So I can put that negative out front like this. I could put it up top, but if I do that, I need to add parentheses. Or I could take that negative and distribute it to said parentheses and change the sign. So that one really had 3 different answers you could have given. Any of those I would have accepted. We just don't want the negative in the denominator. Questions on that one? So then 9, we were trying to get x by itself. C is the closest thing to it. And in this case, we would just subtract. So a lot of us started with this, but then something happened and we started to divide. So nothing here is being multiplied, so we shouldn't be dividing. We should just rewrite this as D minus R minus C. So try to keep those 2 things separate. If you are subtracting, just subtract. If you are dividing, just divide. But don't mix up those 2. Questions on that one? 10 was very similar, and there were a couple different ways we could have went about this. Let's say we did the same thing here, where we got rid of C, subtracted it, because it's positive, so opposite. If we did that, the x would not be by itself. It's still negative, so we got to get rid of that negative. Some of us just didn't put the negative, or maybe erased it, and we can't do that because that doesn't solve the problem. We have to remember that this is really -1. They're being multiplied together, so I could get rid of that by dividing. And I'm going to do that to every single thing, so that all the signs change. These negatives would cancel, become x. This would become -d. This would become -r. And the negatives would cancel, making a positive c. So that's one method for that one. You could have also instead of moving c, let's say we move x. And at first that doesn't look like it's going to help us. But if I move x to the other side by adding, well, now my x is it's positive. When I go to solve it, it will be by itself. But I got to get rid of d and r. And I would be subtracting those, and I can do that at the same time to the other side. So c minus d minus r equals x. These look different, but they're really the same thing, just in a different order. So there are multiple ways to get to the answer. Just make sure you are following math laws, rules. If it mathematically makes sense, it's okay. Any questions so far? I know this was the part we struggled with, so if there's something you're not understanding, please ask. In 11, we were solving for A, getting A by itself. C and A are multiplying. Things that are right next to each other are multiplying. Things, and you can divide. If they are not next to each other, don't put them together. Okay, so if they were adding or subtracting, don't put them together like they're multiplying. I can divide both sides by C. These C's cancel, just leaving A. And that was the final answer. And then for 12, again, solving for A, we got to get rid of M. We can do that by adding to the other side. So that A equals N plus P plus M. Have any questions about those last two or this section in general? Say again. This one? Yeah. Why did we divide it? Yes, it is. Say again. Okay. So I explained to some of you what the project was. I'm just going to re-explain that. Before I do that, let me talk about that quiz really quickly. I am going to replace your test grade. I'm replacing your quiz grade with the test grade if it's better. So if you do better on the test on the project, I will go back and replace that to include your Delta Math assignments if you've attempted them. So not if you've never attempted them. The project consists of two parts. Ignore name. So it has two parts. It's going to be a set of rules. You're going to read through these rules, and you're going to be creating your own equations based on whatever it says. You can use your notes, but let's say I find a multi-step equation that has variables on both sides and would equal 0 in my notes. I can't put that on this. You have to create your own. So there are directions on both the front and back of this, but it's the same. The only thing that's different is when it's talking about the poster, which you'll get from me. Each one has a rubric. Look at that, make sure you have everything it needs. In general, if you finish today, great. But if you don't finish today, you'll also have flex day in class Monday. And then in general, for all tests, you have up until the next test. So you have to finish Unit 1 test or project by Unit 2 test. Okay? Is there anyone that wants to do the project that I didn't already talk to? Okay. Did you want to do the project? Okay. So that means everyone else is taking the test. Did you want to do the project? Okay. All right.